This is another in the series, Australians Take Back Your Country. I'm talking to Peter Manuel from Flag Australia. And Peter, you have a number of matters in South Australia which are relevant for the theme, Australians, it's time to take back your country. Peter.
Yes, good to talk to you again, David. Yeah, we've got a few things happening here in South Australia, and not good things, David. Very, very disappointing with the Stephen Marshall Liberal government at the moment in regards to GM crops. They're really pushing the GM crops in the mainland and South Australia, and the everyday South Australian is dead against that one. I can assure you of that. Also, with what they're privatising in this state, and I'm pretty sure they went to a state election saying they weren't going to allegedly privatise anything. Well, they're going against that, and also something very, very interesting that Clive Palmer has made an offer to our Premier Stephen Marshall in regards to buying 5 extracorporeal life support machines for the Women and Children's Hospital here in South Australia. We've had 4 baby deaths here in South Australia because we haven't got these life support machines. We've got to go to Victoria or go to New South Wales, got to go to Sydney. And of course, now with the closure of the border in Victoria, had to take the children to Sydney, which is absolutely disgusting. I mean, the Labor Party should have done this years ago. Clive Palmer has made a very, very generous offer to buy 5, which is urgently needed. And allegedly Stephen Marshall has knocked back his offer, which I just find it very, very strange. I mean, if this is political because Clive Palmer is in the political arena and so on, I think it's about lives. And we've got the Liberals supporting abortion to birth, full-term abortion to birth. I mean, what are this mob about? I just can't believe it. When, you know, we're murdering babies, we're not keeping babies alive, and we could be to have this machine that Clive Palmer's offered. I think this Liberal Party here in South Australia has completely lost the plot, big time. And it makes me sort of very, very sad to think that Stephen Marshall is really bringing out some very, very silly policies, David, and it's not good. It's not good.
Peter, just on that, if I may interrupt you. Firstly, I would have thought the borders should be open for such an emergency. You don't keep children in Adelaide if they could be treated in Sydney or Melbourne purely because of the ridiculous closure of the borders in relation to the virus. And secondly, when I looked it up, as you suggested, I saw that the Premier said it wasn't a question of money. Well, if it's not a question of money, why don't they have them? He said we're waiting for medical advice. Well, I would have thought having those machines there would be important. The evidence is there, the children died, and they shouldn't have died, and I think that's a shocking thing. I agree with you completely concerning this obsession by politicians with abortion. We've had some ridiculous developments there. In New South Wales, for example, after the last election, without any suggestion of it being mentioned in the policy notices of the parties before the election, they thought it urgent to improve or make easier abortion. And obviously they wanted to increase the number of abortions. And they even included in a bill a provision which made for or provided for the parents, the mother and the hospital doctor to agree to deal with a baby which escaped an abortion. Baby gets out of the abortion, it lives. And this was a provision in the bill to allow for the infanticide, the killing of that baby, the allowing of it to die. Now, I remember when this was passed, and there's an obsession among politicians about killing off babies. When a similar bill passed in New York, in the New York Senate last year, I think it was either last year or this year, there was a standing ovation by Democrat senators in the New York Senate. And I think this is appalling, this obsession with deaths that we have with our politicians. In Victoria, there was an obsession with introducing euthanasia. Well, the Victorian government was responsible for over 800 deaths of elderly people, vulnerable people, who should have been looked after because of the virus. And they mismanaged through their incompetence that. And most of the deaths in Australia were caused by that. The New South Wales government was responsible for deaths in New South Wales because of its mishandling of the entry requirements concerning the Ruby Princess. They all jumped on having lockdowns of productive industry. They forgot that the two most important things they should all be doing in relation to the virus was controlling entry. The second thing was protecting the vulnerable. They all seem to think that the way to deal with this is closing down the economies of Australia at enormous cost. There were more deaths. I was reading there were more deaths a few years ago from one of the epidemics, the SARS epidemic in Australia. I was reading that there were estimated to be about 1,600 deaths. There was no such carry-on about closing down the productive part of the economy, because that's not going to work to eradicate a virus. They said they introduced the lockdown to flatten the curve. The idea of flattening the curve is to handle the number of cases coming into the hospitals. And they had modelling before them when they started this in the National Cabinet. Computer modelling is always a substitute for judgment. Computer modelling, as the great statistician, great Anglo-American statistician, Professor George Box once said, modelling is always wrong. But it's useful, a useful tool. It's always wrong because you can never really replicate real life with a computer model. You can't use computer models to substitute good judgment. But the modelling they used for starting the lockdown in Australia was based on Imperial College London, the approach taken by them. They'd always been wrong over a number of problems. Not only that, they made a mistake in the actual modelling. They transposed the number of intensive care units that they needed in the hospitals with the number of beds they needed in hospitals. And they estimated that we had a daily need of intensive care units in Australia. This is in the modelling that went before the National Cabinet, of 35,000. And nobody in the National Cabinet realised, even thought that this was such a ridiculous estimate that it ought to be looked at again. Nobody in their armies of advisors, because they've all got vast armies of advisors paid for by the taxpayers, 35,000. We're using about 3 or 4 at the moment. 35,000, and that got through the National Cabinet. And on the basis of that, they introduced the lockdown, allegedly to flatten the curve. Now we have the Victorian Premier using the lockdown to eradicate the virus. And no epidemiologist says you can eradicate the virus without there being a vaccine. The virus is going to be there, it's got in, it's going to be there. You can't eradicate it. The last thing you should be doing is closing down your economy and having these ridiculous politicians saying how many people can go to church, how many people can go to the races, all that sort of rubbish, complete rubbish in relation to the lockdown. The problem is, as we often say, Peter, the problem is that there is no significant problem in Australia, which, if it weren't created by the politicians, has been made significantly worse by them. We have an inferior group of politicians who think they're smarter than the rest of us. They're not. They showed that with the lockdown, which is completely unnecessary. The South Australian Premier and his attitude to the machines to protect the children, I think, is showing the very same attitude. Premier Victoria is showing the same attitude in the minuscule way in which he's trying to control everything in that state. Politicians are power hungry and they have to be restrained. Peter.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, David. And it's very, very annoying to think that all Stephen Marshall had to do was say, thank you very much, Clive Palmer. Let's get it happening now. And there'd be a lot of parents out there that would say, Stephen Marshall, you've done the right thing here. Forget about politics. I wonder if Clive Palmer wasn't involved with politics at all, and he was going to make a donation to the Liberal Party as well. Whether Stephen Marshall would say, "Oh yes, we'll take your offer." David, another thing as well that really irks me, and we've spoken about it quite a few times on Australians Take Back Your Country. I watched the 7:30 report the other night, Lee Sales, and they were talking about the bushfires in Kangaroo Island, and there was no mention. She mentioned about the lightning strike at the national park, but there was no mention, and this is where Donald Trump talks about the fake news, which is 100% correct, and we've got it here in Australia, the fake news. But I was very disappointed in Lee Sales when she didn't mention, now she might not have known about it, but she didn't mention the bulldozer driver that was ready to go in and contain that fire when it was only burning the size of a football oval when the lightning struck the national park in Flinders Chase. That bulldozer driver has fought many, many fires over the years, and he could have contained that fire. And as a result, they wouldn't let him in. There was a phone call by all accounts and stopped him. Whoever stopped him, whoever made that phone call, as far as I'm concerned, should be locked up, because have a look at what's happened. All the native animals that's gone, the stock, the sheep, the cattle, all the other animals, businesses, 2 lives lost, absolutely disgraceful. So, you know, when things are reported, whether it's the ABC or mainstream media or what, we want honest reporting, because we out here now know exactly what's going on, because people video things, they put it up on Facebook, and we hear firsthand exactly what's going on. So this mainstream media mob are looking absolute drongos, David, with what they're reporting, because we know exactly what's happening, I can assure you. So in regards to these fires, coming up to the fire season, we're not doing enough here in South Australia. They're only saying a few things about we're going to give 120 million to build or buy some new fire engines and different equipment. You've got to reduce the fire, the hazard reduction big time, because a lot of these fire engines won't go down these dirt roads because of the scrub, and the density of the bush is so thick. So it doesn't matter what machine you got, they won't go down there. We've got to start cleaning up our backyard. That's what we have to do, David, if we're serious about saving native animals, livestock, lives, homes, the whole lot. We need to clean up the backyard, and it's not happening quick enough, and it should be. So this is another thing that the Marshall government's going to have to put up with. They're in power to see what happens this bushfire season. And don't blame it on climate change, because climate change doesn't cause bushfires. Lunatics, the odd lightning strike and the accident. But climate change, don't blame climate change. It's a load of rubbish. David.
Yes, this seems to be universal. Those who want to use the Paris Accords to control us seem to be prepared to blame anything on so-called climate change, which is the new name. Always remember that they never used to talk about climate change, because the climate is always changing. They used to call it global warming, but when the warming stopped, they had to find another excuse, and it's now called climate change. And we know that the problems with the bushfires can be managed. We're always going to have bushfires, but they can be managed, and managed significantly, if the fuel load is controlled and if there's access, particularly into these national parks. We had a Premier in New South Wales, Bob Carr, who was locking up half the state into national parks. And what they did when they locked the national parks up, they just left them. They didn't care for them. They were mismanaged. And there was vast amounts of fuel. And obviously, if you're going to leave fuel on the floor and there's a fire, that will only intensify the fire. And that's the big problem in Australia. It's the same problem in California. And it just has to be looked after properly, as it used to be in the days when politicians weren't run by silly dogma. So that's what we've got to do. So, Peter, what else is happening in South Australia?
Since we've just had this chat, David, something's just come to mind. Remember the Packer Whacker? Remember when Kerry Packer was having a heart attack and an ambulance come past, and it was the only ambulance in New South Wales, I think, that had a fibrillator in it, and it saved his life. And while he was in hospital, he actually rang Nick Greiner, the Premier of New South Wales, and said he'd like to donate some money to put them in every ambulance in New South Wales. And Nick Greiner said, great, we'll go halves. So, Stephen Marshall could have done something very, very similar to what Nick Greiner had done. And we must thank Kerry Packer that...
Yes. Peter, we're having a slight transmission problem. That doesn't matter.
Are you there, David?
Yes.
What part of that did you hear?
I heard most of it. I think there was there's probably a weather problem between us. But what you were saying, that Kerry Packer ordered that fibrillators be bought, or offered to pay for fibrillators in the ambulances in New South Wales because of his personal experience, and the Premier agreed to go along with that. He accepted that, unlike the Premier of South Australia, who's refused the offer from Clive Palmer, saying it's not a question of money. If it's not a question of money, well, why don't they just have them? I can't see why you wouldn't have them in South Australia. Why you'd need to send children to another capital.
It's about saving lives, and we need them. We need them desperately here in South Australia. And Stephen Marshall, you need to really assess your comments because they're not good.
Yes.
David, if I can ask you a question, can you just let people know again, with Australians Take Back Your Country, how they can come on board, and this petition that you've put together? If you can just briefly let people know what we're up to, would be great.
Yes. Well, there's a petition which will be with the text of this video. But what it's all about is this. The system of representative democracy, which we've introduced into Australia, which came with the British in the middle of the 19th century and was included in the federation proposals, essentially is based on the political parties. The political parties weren't strong at the time of federation. They weren't strong in the early years of federation, but gradually they've become stronger, and the principal political parties have been taken over, so much so that they are controlled by small groups, cabals of power breakers who do something outrageous, and that is they control the pre-selections in both parties. And new members of parliament are chosen not by the members of the party, but by small groups. And the idea is that you get somebody into parliament who is loyal to a given power broker and then does what he's told to do, or she's told to do, in the parliament. You don't choose the person on merit, they're chosen for this. The second thing is they've turned politics into a career. Now, governing is not something that you learn. Governing is something which you apply because you've learned a lot of other things. You've learned common sense. You've also learned how to communicate, and you've learned common sense through real life experiences. That's how it used to be. And above all, you have a love of your country. I think Donald Trump, in many ways, exemplifies this. He's come from outside and he governed very well until the virus came in, released from China. He had restored the American economy to a standard that it hadn't been for a very long period of time and reduced unemployment to rates never before known in the United States, particularly in relation to minorities. What we've got is this comparative, I'm sorry, what we've got is a system of representative democracy. We choose our representatives, but we don't really. They're chosen for us. They're career politicians. They go straight from the university into jobs with politicians or in labour with unions. And they spend all of their time in those jobs, plotting and using telephones to manipulate and so on. They don't learn how to govern. They learn how to be Machiavellian plotters. They learn how to be loyal to power brokers, and they work out how to get a safe seat. So you're getting people like the former Vice President, Mr. Biden of the United States, who have spent all their lives in politics, rather than someone who comes with other experiences. And that's a problem. That's a serious problem. So what we're saying is that what we should establish in Australia is something which really is beyond that, something which brings in those politicians who are meritorious, they have merit, and they wish to take part in the political system. And what we're saying is that we should also involve or make the politicians more controllable. The politicians should be controllable 24/7. And there are ways to do this. We see this in Michigan at the moment, the state of Michigan. The governor of the state of Michigan had a really serious, very serious, harsh lockdown. The Supreme Court said she'd gone beyond her powers. At the same time, petitions are circulating in Michigan. And if they're signed by 25% of the electors, if anyone is signed by 25% of the electors, she can be called to a new election. It's called a recall election. So one of the methods of direct democracy is a recall election. Another method is citizen-initiated referendums. When politicians pass laws we don't like, there should be a facility for us to have a petition that if a sufficient number of people sign that petition, there should be a referendum on that legislation or legislation we need, or treaty we don't like. And this happens in a number of countries, and it would mean that with this direct democracy, we can exercise much more control over our politicians. How to do that? The politicians won't do this voluntarily. They could put up a referendum to us to change the constitution to do this. Probably the only way we could do this is by enormous pressure for a convention. The convention was the way we federated. It was an elected body, not a parliament. It was a separately elected body of Australians. Most states participated. And what it involved was people electing representatives to go, not to Canberra. They went around to three of the capitals, Adelaide, Melbourne, and Sydney, and they worked out a constitution for Australia. Once they'd consulted widely, they then finalised the version of the constitution, and then that was put to the people by way of a referendum, a convention. Why did they establish a convention? Problem was that beforehand, when they tried to do it through having a nominated convention, when the constitution was worked out, it went back to the 6 state parliaments. They were called colonial parliaments. And then they fought among themselves as to the terms of the convention. If that had been left like that in the 19th century, we would never have federated. We'd be 6 separate countries now, like South America. We federated because a convention was elected under what was called the Corowa Plan. And once that convention agreed on a constitution, having consulted everyone, the constitution was then put to the people in a series of referendums. Eventually these were passed, and then it was adopted. It had to go to London in those days, but it meant that the people directly contributed. We'd have to have probably another convention in which this would all be fought out. And I think the obvious reform, it's time to reform our constitution, to review our constitution. It's about 120 years old now. It's never been really looked at again by another convention elected by the people. There's time to do that. And I don't think there should be any radical changes, but there should be changes really which control the politicians, because the politicians are completely out of hand. As I said earlier, there's no serious problem in Australia which, if it weren't created by the politicians, has been made significantly worse by them. Think of anything. Try and think of something for which we can't blame the politicians. And I'm not having a go at the politicians, just have a go at the politicians. But think of water. This country should be watered everywhere. Water should be harvested. It should be brought down from where it is. We have an enormous mouth in the north, and it should be making the whole country lush and wonderful and productive. And that way you could support growing towns away from Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, which are overfull. We have towns all over the country servicing the farmers in various parts of the country. We could have a wonderful country which would be productive all over the country, and not so much desert, not so much dry country, but much more country which has a reliable flow of water. There's no reason why we should have the most expensive, or among the most expensive electricity in the world. We used to have the cheapest electricity in the world. We'll never get manufacturing back with the most expensive electricity in the world. The only reason we have that is because the politicians all feel that they have to agree to the Paris Accord. A real lover of Australia wouldn't do that to the country. That's why Donald Trump walked out of Paris, because he knew it would destroy the American economy. It wouldn't make a difference to the weather. It's a fiction. It's a silly fiction to think that politicians can change the climate. Of course they can't. So the thing is, and there'll be a reference to a petition on this. We really, I think, and I can see this is the only way out, we really have to press for the election of a convention and for the people to review the Constitution. And once that is being reviewed, that it should be argued that there should be much greater control by ordinary people, as there is in Switzerland, over the politicians, so they become what they really are, the elected public servants. They're behaving now like they're our masters, and they don't have the experience, they don't have the ability, they don't have the common sense, and they've shown that. They showed all the time to be running our lives the way they are. So Australians, take back your country. Peter.
Yes, David, you certainly nailed that. And the trouble is, we've got a bunch of liars in there too. Have a look what Daniel Andrews. How he's lied to the people. He should be locked up. David, yeah, if we can just tell the people to get onto that petition and sign it and share it and get as many people on board as possible, that way it's putting the power back to the people. And we're not being paid for what we're doing. We're doing Peter, all this.
Yes, Peter, I think it's the only way. I may be wrong. I don't think a new party is going to answer our problems. I don't think the existing parties are going to do it. There are a few politicians who are good and think of Australia. Their first love is Australia. They're not thinking of the riches and the jobs they can get out of politics. They're really thinking of Australia, but there aren't enough of them. We have to rely on the common sense of ordinary Australians, because so often they're much smarter than our politicians. Peter.
They certainly are, David. So people, come on board. What we're doing is we're making this available for you to take back the power. So it's up to you now to sign the petition and share it amongst your friends. Make it go viral, please. But we certainly need change. And thank you very much, David. I certainly enjoy the chats.
Thank you, Peter. Good, Peter. I think that
It's still,
I'm not sure
still,
that that's off.
it's still recording.
Right.